Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Managing Work and Career in the Age of COVID, What's Next for Mothers and Parents. This is the second webinar in a series of 3 devoted to supporting mothers and parents in their many roles during the pandemic, co-hosted by alma maters and Beyond Barnard. My name is Jessica Muss, Barnard class of 1998, chair of the Alma Maters Committee of the Alumni Association of Barnard College. I am also the proud parent of a Barnard Student of the Year 2024. As a quick reminder, this event is being recorded. Attendees will not have microphone or camera access during this online event. Attendees' voice, likeness, or images will not be captured by Barnard College. Your written submission of questions, however, may be shared during the Q&A portion. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were 2.2 million fewer women in the labor force in October of 2020 than in October of 2019. While not the only cause for this exodus, there has been an increase in caregiving responsibilities that may jeopardize women's ability to both stay in the workforce and progress. The first in this series was held last month and focused on the emotional impacts of the pandemic on parents. Following today's third event of this series will be Advocacy for Women, Working Parents, and Guardians. That will take place in July, and the exact date will be announced shortly. The mission of Alma Maters is to provide mothers with thoughtful discussions and programming on all aspects of parenting and work-life balance. By hosting presentations, workshops, and discussions that span the years of parenting from prenatal to college-age children. Beyond Barnard supports students and alumni as they define, pursue, and achieve success in their careers and communities. I am delighted to introduce Christine Valenza-Shin, Barnard class of 1984 and Associate Dean for Beyond Barnard. Beyond Barnard serves as the college's hub for advising and resources around careers, internships, competitive fellowships, and applications to grad school and professional schools. Christine oversees both day-to-day operations and supports ongoing strategy planning. She has been with Beyond Barnard, previously known as Career Development, since 2009. She advises and develops programs for students and alumni alike. Earlier in her career, she was a teacher and teacher educator. At Barnard, Christine majored in history and minored in education. I now turn the program over to you, Christine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's been a pleasure to work with you and our colleagues in Alumni Relations on this series. And I'm excited to be here today to talk sort of not so much big picture, but little picture. The title is What's Next for Mothers and Parents, and really the title probably should have been What's Next for You. We're going to very much focus in on ideas and practical strategies to manage wherever you're at in the process. So I'm going to jump in and share my screen and go through some slides and some suggestions and leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So yes, as I would say, you know, we toyed around with the title, and we wanted to get the mothers and parents in there, but it's really going to be relatively individually focused. But of course, the challenge there is we're not quite sure of where everyone is at. And so I tried to accommodate a series of different possibilities and give practical suggestions for all. I want to talk a little bit just about Beyond Barnard. Not everyone may be familiar with the rebranding and reorganization that took place 3 years ago. As Jessica mentioned in the intro, Beyond Barnard was known as the Office of Career Development, and before that, Barnard Career Services. It's had different names over the years. And as Jess mentioned, this is our mission statement. And, the important parts I think about this are the ands, students and alumni. Barnard has always supported, given career support to its alumni. And then the careers and communities, recognizing the fact that, although our focus is primarily on professional development and professional options, that roles in the community are also very important and a very important part of people's lives. So um, our other sort of motto, I guess, is your path, your purpose. And just a very general overview, we do a series of events and programs, sometimes in conjunction with alumni relations and the various committees, sometimes on our own. And there is individualized advising available to alumni. And we also have student to alumni mentoring programs, which we have now expanded through our mentoring platform, Barnard Connect, to alumni mentoring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. And we also have digital resources. Alumni Relations actually is really good about posting some of those on their site. And then we also post on our site, Beyond Barnard. Well, it's actually barnard.edu/Beyond Barnard. But we're here to talk. Beyond Barnard is here. We have lived through the pandemic, just like everybody else, as workers and specifically as people whose mission it is to support people in their job searches and their career explorations and all of the other parts. And so, we've been dealing both primarily and secondarily with the impact of COVID ourselves. This is a fairly no big news here, but just wanted to mention some of the major impacts here. Like everyone else, we in office jobs, we transitioned on, I believe, March 13th of 2020 to work from home, which was initially going to be for 2 weeks, and here we are, about to go back actually full time in the office on August 15th. Obviously, we've all lived through, no matter what your situation, a major disruption of work, family, home balance. I put balance in quotes because I know that whole notion of work-life balance has been challenged on a number of cases. Clearly, especially early on last year, people dealing with layoffs and furloughs. On the student side, we had a fair number of canceled internships, some canceled internships, a lot postponed, and some postponed, especially job offers. And really, for most of them, a lot didn't have jobs lined up yet, since most hiring takes place sort of March through May. And then obviously hiring disruptions impacted both students and alumni. And with that sort of hiring disruptions, whether there were official or unofficial hiring freezes, one of the big impacts has been increased workloads for everybody. And then of course, disproportionate impact on women of color and lower paid workers. So all of this is challenges that we've all been facing individually as well as collectively. And so, over the course of the year and a half, we've shared some thoughts about this, some reassurances, some context building. From a career point of view, no career development point of view, or career advising point of view, no single year is going to define your entire career trajectory. And that's especially true of this year and a half. And so it's important to remember that it's easy to think individually and think, oh, how is this going to look on my resume? How is this choice I made, or this choice my employer made to furlough me or lay me off, or how is this going to look on an individual basis? But from a collective point of view, we've all been through this and had various impacts, and it's important to remember that. Again, as it says here, that you're part of a broad community of workers, of women, of people in the United States, people in the world, facing a range of challenges and opportunities. But back on the individual level, regardless of the sort of big picture, it's important to take some time to reflect and transition. And that's what we're going to look at So I broke it down in one of our earlier conversations. in planning for this session, we sort of dealt with the reality that people are going to be at different stages. I'm assuming that some of you in the audience have left work or scaled back work significantly because of COVID. Others may have been laid off or furloughed. Some of you may already have been not full-time in the workforce, working full-time at home or part-time at home. So we're going to look at 3 stages and 4 tasks, right? So the first stage would be departure. Either you're planning on departing, stepping back from the workforce, or you may have already done that in the last year and a half. And then an in-between period. Many of you may be in the middle of, or at the start of, or towards the end of a work hiatus, or some sort of scaling back. And then the final phase would be return. And again, I'm assuming you all are at different stages with that. Some of you may be actively planning a return. Some of you may have just returned. Others of you, it may be either unclear when you might go back or what you're thinking about. And then after we look at these 3 stages and the 4 tasks within them, we'll look at some closing thoughts. Hold on one second. My work from home challenge mainly is the dog, which you'll probably hear from one point or another. Okay, so as I said, the 3 stages. The work hiatus or the scaling back could be for a variety of reasons. And there's been some interesting pieces in the media and obviously anecdotal evidence of there are people who are, making the choice to step back, not necessarily leave their job first, but many have, but really taking the opportunity for a career reset or a change to really think about, what's important to them, valuable to them. Right. And then the important note in the return is exactly this question: is whether your plan, if you are planning on returning now or later, would it be in your former field, former or related field, or a new field or a new endeavor for you? So the 4 tasks we're going to look at for each of these phases is career exploration, which is both the looking inward part and as well as looking out and figuring out what's out there. Networking. How do you build and maintain professional relationships, either as you're leaving, while you're out, and when you're returning? And then 2 other tasks: skill building and professional development, and resume and LinkedIn profile, which gets us a little more towards the strategic part of all of this. So let's first look at departure, right? So if you are leaving, have left, or if you're planning on leaving or you've left recently, some of these specific questions, to take a look at. This can be hard when you're in the middle of a tough decision, or if you've been on the receiving end of layoffs or furloughs, or even if you've chosen to leave, but you feel like you had no choice but to leave. Emotions run high. But when you have the chance at some point to do a little bit of this reflection, think about things, a little bit more big picture. Just these are simple questions that I often will talk to about anybody, any alum who comes in for advising around, whether it's a job search, career change, something more of a crisis situation, but often will ask these basic questions. Motivated skills, the definition I use, which I think is the helpful one, it's those skills, those things you do at work that you both enjoy and you're good at. So, it's the kind of thing you get, sometimes people describe it as being immersed in, and time sort of goes quickly. Burnout skills would be the opposite. Well, not the opposite, but it would be things that you do a lot of, but you don't particularly enjoy. So you might well be very good at them, which actually might lead to being asked to do more of that. But since you don't ultimately enjoy them, you can end up spending a lot of time and thus, burnout. And then, a question often that's posed to people at any stage of this is, what would you add or take away if you could redesign your job? Right. I put exit interviews in quotes, not referring to the formal exit interview that you may or may not have done with HR or may or may not have, but to take the opportunity either before you leave or just after you've left to talk and talk a little bit about big picture, where the field might be going, where opportunities might be in the future. And this is not only for your own sort of information, but it also helps establish the fact that you're not necessarily leaving forever. And then on a more practical matter, if you didn't before you left, if you've left recently, or even if it was a while ago, one of the, what sometimes can be a possibility when you've left work, left a job, is to continue the relationship on a contract basis or consulting. And then, again, I often will pose these scenarios to people when they're sort of in this phase of thinking about what's next is, if you hadn't left, or if you weren't planning to leave, what would happen next? Would you, if you could wave a magic wand and sort of had your choice to do what you wanted, would you change something, make a shift within the field or the organization that you're like to, make a more significant change to a new field or a venture? A fair number of people think about, starting their own business or starting their own practice on an individual basis. So we don't want to forget that as an option either. Again, sort of more on the practical side here, as you're leaving, or if you have recently left, or even if it's been a little while since you left, you could definitely reach out. At the very least, it's relatively low-hanging fruit would be to connect to people on LinkedIn if you haven't. Those people that you are particularly close with or particularly valued, can't hurt. LinkedIn's not a perfect communication form. Not everybody checks it. Not everybody keeps it up to date. So it could be helpful to think as you're leaving, or if you've recently left, about who you would want to keep in touch with, and share a personal email account, which could be separate just for professional correspondence, or your main email. And then, as you're contemplating leaving, or if you have just left, if you do come across any colleagues or friends who have done this before, who've left the workplace for, a short, medium, or long term, what perspective do they have that could be helpful for you? And finally, again, this would be more apropos if you haven't left yet, but you're thinking about leaving or thinking about making a major change, is take a look and see if on the professional association side, maybe you are a member, maybe you let that lapse, see if you can join or rejoin. A lot of professional associations and organizations have been online for the past year and a half. Some of them are maybe starting to plan for some in-person in the future. I think that's still a little up in the air, especially for big conferences, but there's a lot of virtual events happening out there, and there are some smaller regional events. Again, some of those are virtual, some of them could potentially be in person faster than the big national conferences. So, could be an opportunity to, attend something and sort of, be thinking big picture, where's the profession heading, what are some of the big issues going on in this before you leave. And then if there are in-house training opportunities and you still are at your job, think about taking advantage of those as well. And then finally, again, back on the practical level, while you're still there, or while it's still fresh in your mind, getting your current, your most recent job, the job you're leaving, or the job you left recently, onto your resume. We describe an everything or master resume. This is a document that's just for you. It's not going to be shared with anybody. And it's a great place to just jot down, you can do 20 bullets for every job if you want, but it's a good place. It's a draft, but it's a good place to try and capture, things that you did accomplish in your job that you're leaving. So, and, if your LinkedIn profile is either underutilized or kind of bare bones, it's not a bad opportunity, not a bad time to pop in and, start filling in some of those sections you might not have filled in or updated recently. The skills section in particular, it keeps expanding. I think at the moment you can list up to 50 skills. And it's one of those general LinkedIn recommendations to click off as many of those as apply, or add them. You can add them yourselves and see. Recruiters can use that as a search function for particular skill sets. So it's something, but again, we're sort of more on the side of, just trying to capture some of this before you step away from the workplace when, some of the stuff might not be, top of mind. And it's also a good opportunity as you're leaving someplace. And this would be even if you're not leaving for a hiatus, but leaving to move on to something else, to gather up all the, the things you've written about yourself and that others have written about you, and keeping an eye for future references. So now let's talk a little bit about hiatus, about this time period that many of you may be in now. And like I said, it could predate COVID. It could be intended as very short term, or it might be a while with no particular plans to go back. But let's look at some of these tasks in that context. With career exploration, one of the things I say to everyone, even if they're sure they're staying in their field, even if they're just looking for the next job or the next step up, it still is always a good opportunity to step back and think a little bit more. And I mentioned some of these in the earlier phase, but again, you want to take a look inward, right? And here, because you're on hiatus now, you're not actively in a job. It's looking sort of more broadly, not just the most recent job, but when you look back on your work history in general, what have you enjoyed in the past? Maybe you were in a job that you didn't love that much, but there's previous jobs that you did like elements of it, right? And I think that last bullet is important, which is to, this decision or non-decision to, leave the workforce can be an ego blow, and it can feel very much, you can feel very conflicted about the value you bring, but it doesn't, the circumstances, whatever your personal circumstances are, don't erase the value that you bring to a position. And so it's helpful to think about that. There are actual assessment tools, which this can be a good time period to take advantage of it. Through Beyond Barnard, you can take the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is, there's a lot of informal or unofficial versions of it out on the web, but we have the specifically the career report, the career focused version of it. And then the strong interest inventory looks at interest and motivations, which is another assessment. And then there's the other two quadrants we tend to look at with career exploration is values and skill sorts. Those are external to us, but we can refer you to them if you would be interested in that. And as they apply, you're sorting things. So it sort of forces you through a series of decisions. And then after the look inward, then there's the look outward. All right, what's out there? And you may have a general sense. You may not have kept up with all the changes. You may have been in a job or a particular field for a long period of time and not had an opportunity to sort of look on a broader basis what's going on. ONET is a website, a U.S. Department of Labor website that is basically a compendium of job titles that exist. And so it gives very detailed descriptions of various job titles as well as related job titles. So it can be a little overwhelming, the amount of information, but I encourage people, especially at this stage, to use it to explore and to, I'll say set a timer for 20 minutes and just kind of click around. And especially on the related jobs, or, sometimes it just takes you in a circle, but sometimes it can lead you to some interesting job titles, job opportunities that you may not have heard of or haven't thought about. There's also a lot of states have career zone. So if you do like Career Zone New York, or the state that you live in, that have some of it's just workforce analysis information, but there's various resources on there as well. So generally, if you go to your state Department of Labor, there often will be links there to resources for career explorers, job changers, or job seekers in general. So. And then, of course, there's the world of people. You can research online, and there's a lot of information online, but also talking to people and, setting up conversations, which is what the next slide is about, which is talking to people. So when you're out of the workforce, short-term or long-term, it's easy to forget that, you can still talk to people about work. And so, general rule of thumb, if, it's one of those questions, that happens whenever you meet people. Very often, one of the earliest questions is, what do you do? And if somebody's doing something interesting, big, little, ask them about it. But you also can do this in a more planned way, which would be to look through LinkedIn or Barnard Connect, which, as I mentioned, is our mentoring website, connecting website. It's sort of like LinkedIn just for Barnard students and alumni. And some of the possible questions to ask people, again, either in a spontaneous or a planned way. I mean, it's always, that second one's always important. It's always easy to get kind of rose-colored glasses sometimes in preliminary conversations, but you want to talk about the challenges and the difficulties of the work they do, not just what they like about it. Considering different pathways, sometimes there's very rigid pathways to particular jobs sometimes, but a lot of times you'll be surprised all the different ways people get in. And then, back to the bigger picture, what's happening in their field, what skill sets are sought after in their work. And part of this is just, again, I'm not talking about spending your entire hiatus constantly thinking and talking about work. But these are all suggestions of ways to keep some of this, some of your future plans kind of present, and in your mind as you have time, and as you have urgency, depending on your situation. It's also, it can be an opportunity, time off from work can be an opportunity to connect and reconnect with people that it's hard to do when you're in the middle of all your personal and professional obligations. So again, just some ideas here of people you might have fallen out of touch with, or connections you might have forgotten about. We talk a lot about the Barnard Network, and it's a really strong one, but a lot of you may have gone to grad school, and that's a network as well. And high school can be an interesting network too. Just to sort of, I look occasionally to see, I grew up in Durham, New Hampshire, and it's interesting to see where I'll put the name of my high school and then filter for New York and just see who else from my high school, lives and works in or near New York like I do. So, and then, again, if you're newly home, or if you're taking more time, if you're expanding the amount of time you're home and in the community potentially, there's new people you will meet, right? And then just a couple of suggestions at the end that, connecting to somebody on LinkedIn, it doesn't just have to be in your field, and of course, certain fields lend themselves to connections across fields. So, and that final point, keep in light touch with former colleagues. Again, you're on hiatus, you're away from your job, either short-term or long-term. You don't need to be constantly connecting with former colleagues, unless of course they're, personal friends as well. But it is definitely, you can definitely send a message on LinkedIn. You could definitely, send a holiday email. There's ways of sort of keeping in light touch with colleagues that, you would like to be in touch with, or just sort of stay on their radar. This time in between jobs, or this time out from the workforce can be a good opportunity, depending on your circumstances, financial and time commitment wise, but an opportunity to skill build. I sort of arranged it from low hanging fruit to the much higher hanging fruit. So there are a plethora of online tutorials, starting with YouTube videos and all sorts of others. There's one-off webinars, there's classes that are open and free or low cost. There's certification programs, which are kind of in the middle ground. They aren't generally free, and they do have a cost attached to them, both money-wise and time-wise, but they're not generally as expensive or as time long as graduate school options. But these are all all things that people can either consider or just go ahead and jump in and do when they're in between or on a hiatus. And it is possible, especially if you, again, after that initial adjustment to no longer working can be tough, the assumption is, again, depending on if it was your choice because of circumstances, you may not have a ton of time on your hands, but if you find your work brain kind of resurfacing, reading professional journals, following various thought leaders on LinkedIn and the internet in general can be a way of, sort of either reactivating or keeping in touch with what's going on. Time to write can be hard to come by, certainly when you're working full time and caring for family and your personal life, but you may have a little bit more flexibility in your schedule to do something like that. And then professional organizations in general very often welcome people on to volunteer for a role, which again can be hard to do when you're working full time and caring for yourself and family full time, but could have a little bit more time, during this hiatus. And then in terms of actually, keeping your resume active or doing things, building up experiences that you could add to your resume. Um, if you do any professional work, even short term, definitely add it to your everything resume. It may not make it onto an actual application or networking resume, but it's helpful and professional work doesn't just mean paid things. It could mean volunteer things, anything, but anything that sort of draws on your professional skills, either, existing skills or new things that you're learning. On your LinkedIn profile, you're going to be a little bit more selective because that is public facing, and you don't know if let's say you did a short-term project for, a family member who runs a small business and it's either unrelated, to what you have done or like to do, you might not want to put that on your LinkedIn profile, but there's other things, especially, sort of strategic volunteering that you might actually want to, have up on your LinkedIn profile and add at this point. There are a lot of short-term opportunities out there, especially at the moment when things are kind of volatile. And, there was sort of a move towards this even pre-COVID of contract-based work, consultant-based work. So something to think about. Part-time work in general. I've worked with quite a number of alumni who, what they did while they were at home for, 5 to 7 years, raising small children, for instance, is, they helped out in a family business, or they helped out in a small practice of a friend, taking on various roles again. So it's something to think about and look for. And then I mentioned this a couple times, strategic volunteering. Strategic in the sense of not everything volunteer is resume worthy necessarily. You have to be a little bit, sometimes it is good just to sort of show community, activism or participation. But in terms of actual professional skills, looking towards leadership or project management roles is helpful. And things that either build new skills or maintain roles. So specifically taking on budgeting or communications or something like that for an organization can be, again, strategic. Is this a way to keep my skills active? Is this a way to sort of learn or expand? So, okay. All right, and then our final phase, I'm just going to check the time here. I want to make sure I leave time. Good. Okay. We'll just wrap up in another 5 or 10 minutes and then have some chance for questions. So then there's the returning. So again, this may be a ways off for you. It may be imminent, but what are some of the things you can be doing in these 4 tasks if you're thinking of returning? So basically the idea would be to sort of, in career exploration, would be to be a little less relaxed and sort of wide open to all possibilities and start getting a little bit more focused. So if you hadn't, for instance, done career assessments yet and you would like to, and sort of get a more focused idea of what your strengths and interests and things like that might be, or you could revisit the results if you had taken them at some point earlier. The making it real phase is important in career exploration. What would this actually look like if you've been considering lots of possibilities or even just 1 or 2? What's the timeline? What are the finances in terms of what you would need to do to be ready to go back, how much you would want to be making, et cetera. Again, checking in on what the sort of required or desired skills are, and have you gathered those up? Have you, updated those? And the goal here in career exploration as you approach a return is to choose a path, possibly 2. More than 2 gets a little hard. And, this can be hard, especially if you've enjoyed the exploratory part of this and you've been considering lots of different options. Choosing a path or an initial focus at least can be difficult. And that's why the final bullet is here, which is, this would be a really good time to circle, back to Beyond Barnard, myself or one of our other advisors, and talk through some of what you've been thinking about and what your strategy might be. And there's also plenty of other career advisors out there as well. So networking, again, as you're thinking about returning, this is going to get a little more purposeful. But actually, having a plan to return is actually a great time to connect or reconnect with people. Maybe you've been doing some informational interviewing, but this might become a little more intentional, matching up with your particular area of focus. Again, good time to look at, are there conferences or events that can sort of allow you to dip a toe in, reconnect, start, talking to people in the field, being again a little more purposeful on LinkedIn instead of dropping in every once in a while, to make it part of your routine, and potentially on other social media depending on your profession, and beginning to look at companies, organizations that are of interest to you, developing sort of a working list of places you'd be interested in working with, following them on social media, setting up Google alerts, just getting yourself back in that circle of knowing what's going on and knowing what opportunities potentially could be out there. In terms of professional development and skill building, as you start more actively looking at job listings or other opportunities, you might have already seen this, but there might be some new skills, some new things that have, popped up as you become more serious about going back that you might want to do a quick brush up on or introduction to. And if during this hiatus you have been in graduate school or done a certification program, or even just kind of done an amalgamation of coursework, webinars, etc., take advantage of those networks, especially in certification program. Well, actually, it's in all of those settings, certification programs, graduate schools. The instructors are very often from the field and can be really useful, and your fellow students, especially because they come from many different walks of life, often can be helpful as well. And then some of those programs, not so much the sort of random courses and webinars, but certification programs or schools of professional studies, and certainly graduate school have their own career offices and can provide support as well. And then looking again, resume and LinkedIn profile, getting a little bit more purposeful here. You've got a refined or a new focus potentially. And so how are you going to reflect that in resumes that you're actually going to put together to apply to a particular position or to share with somebody that you're networking with? Revisiting your LinkedIn headline and about section. How are you branding yourself? How are you positioning yourself in terms of possibly this new focus or a refined focus? Again, you may already be starting to look at job descriptions, but keep an eye out for how are skills and qualities being described. How can you incorporate that into your resumes and cover letters? I've focused particularly on this throughout on resume and LinkedIn profile, sort of your job documents, but there are a bunch of other aspects to the job search, and we have a lot of we have advising appointments as well as other resources and materials on things like cover letters and interview skills and negotiating and things like that. So, all right. And then I just did want to say a quick word about negotiating. I think it's apropos of COVID in general, the sort of changing, the big changes that are happening out in the workforce, and then whatever you've personally been considering about what's important to you. Part of this analysis is thinking about salary, the importance of salary versus benefits versus flexibility. And that could be time-wise, that could be the, working remotely 100% of the time, part of the time, what's important to you. And there's a lot of information out there, a lot of advice out there about negotiating. Certainly this is another thing you're welcome to circle back to Beyond Barnard for, to sort of work out both a general approach and a specific, any specific offers you might be navigating. And there's a lot of other career sites as well that have information about, negotiation strategy, negotiation preparation. So just to recap, we've been looking at 3 stages, various tasks. I should have said this at the outset, but these are not checklists that you have to complete. These are just a lot of different ideas of things you can be doing, thinking about as you're in these different phases. And then just wanted to share a few closing thoughts and then question and answer. So, at this moment, we're not in the midst of the pandemic, at least in the United States, but, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what's going on, especially different parts of the country, certainly around the world. So there's still continued uncertainty. There's a lot of volatility and flux in the economy as a whole and in the workplace, just so much, literally flux as offices begin to reopen, and some are requiring people to come back, some are staying completely remote. I mean, it's just all over the place, individual companies and organizations. And this is on the one hand really challenging, in the same way it's been challenging for the last year and a half to be able to speak with any certainty about what's going to happen. But there are also opportunities and challenges. There's just a lot of motion going on. There's a lot of people leaving their jobs because they planned to anyway, but they felt kind of stuck for a year and a half. There's certainly a lot of demand for workers across various sectors. So there's a lot going on out there. This can be hard on the one hand. It can feel a little overwhelming, but there's a lot of hiring going on out there. And so if you are thinking about going back, or if you are thinking about leaving one job and moving to another, people are hiring, and we can help you take advantage of that opportunity. In terms of the short term and long term, always that question, I bring this up in an awful lot of appointments, is having people identify what's under your control and what's not. We've certainly all gotten a huge lesson in that, even more than usual for the last year and a half. But it is useful to think about, in a job search, in a career exploration, what can you control? What can't you control? It can't just be about what you're looking for, although we always recommend that you start with that. But then there's other things, you could come up with a list of 3 to 5 things that you're definitely looking for in your next job. You may or may not be able to find them, but hopefully you'll find some of them and adjust to what's going on. So, relatively quick rundown of various things. On the cautious optimism side, as I said, in terms of you being able to find what you're looking for, job vacancies are up across all sorts of sectors. There's lots of movement in general. But on the cautious side, job searches in uncertain times can take longer. And job searches coming back after a career gap can take a while, and as can job searches in a new area or a new venture. So that's a nod to don't take it personally if things don't fall into place right away, and again, that's where we're here to support and help. So I thank you all for sitting through that, and hope that parts of it were helpful depending on your situation. And then I'm going to stop sharing and come back in and see if anybody has questions. It's not a huge group from what I can tell, so you're welcome to unmic if you would like, but you also could chat to the group or to me individually, or it looks like there's maybe just the Q&A. Great. Okay, so I'm going to read this question. After only freelancing during COVID, I'm embarking on a 6-month contract role that I'm a bit unsure about. The industry is different from what I was doing, from doing editorial work for media brands to a consumer goods company, as is the title, which sounds more business focused than editorial. I'm concerned that it could look like an odd detour. Any thoughts on a transition like this? Well, I mean, first of all, the good news is, a 6-month contract role is great. And the fact that you were able to sort of, take your skills into an industry that's different there's also good news in that. Transferable skills and all of that. I would say, I don't think, one answer is, I don't think anything that happens during COVID or as a result of COVID is going to look like an odd detour. I think that you will be able, if anybody questions it, I think you'll be able to explain it. And I think in general, what you're looking for is always a narrative. You need to develop a narrative. It could be in your cover letter, it could be in your networking, it could be in an interview situation of, why did you make the choice you made? And so I think in this case, you could say something along the lines of, I was really, I had worked primarily in media. And although I loved X and Y about that, an opportunity came up to work for a consumer goods company, or however you want to describe that. And, I was really excited to bring my skills to that. And then the key thing here is then, especially in an interview situation, is to then bring that to the company who's talking to you, the company or organization that you're talking to, and say, that's why I'm so excited about this position, or this opportunity. So you sort of go from, here's what I was doing, here's what I brought to this new opportunity and why I took it, and then here's how that fits into what you're hiring for. So those narratives can be tricky. That's where advising can help. I've done this, and my team has done this for a lot of people in a lot of walks of life. So it's definitely something that we can, support you in as you're, as I said, whether you're applying and preparing a cover letter, or getting ready for a networking type of situation, or actually interviewing for a new position. How do you deal with the general fatigue between managing life, current job with long hours, and the new job search? I wish I had a magic answer to that. I guess the key thing that I talk about is it's sort of looking at what works for you. Job searches are tough, no matter whether you're coming from it as somebody who's unemployed, or who's taken a deliberate break and is ready to end that, or currently working. I think that you need to look at what works best for you. Are you somebody who works best in sort of long chunks of time, and could find a, say, 2 or 3 hour chunk in your week or weekend to be able to dedicate to this? Or are you more of a, somebody who could do a little bit? So if you set the alarm 20 minutes earlier, or, were able to find a time period during the day, before work, after work, during work, or, in the evening, are you a chip away at it a little bit of a time? And you can experiment with that, or you may already know that about yourself. And to me, the key is just to break down this huge task of finding a job into smaller tasks. So having a checklist on what we call the open market, which is applying to jobs, and sort of the public facing part of companies and organizations, but also making sure that you have a checklist for networking, and try and get granular, like reach out, find 3 Barnard alumni working in X field, each time I sit down, reach out to them, apply, look for X number of jobs, just having a checklist. And then the routine is more important than the actual hours spent, is, one thing I say. So I guess I tend to answer that question from a time management point of view, but also from an empathetic point of view, is it's just job search is tough. Yeah. So you have my empathy, and you have our support in terms of practical ways to make it more manageable. Other questions? I have a lot of apprehension about the possibility of going back to a full-time role because of a toxic past role, and the potential of having to go back to an office post during COVID. That's made me very tentative about applying to roles, but I don't want to limit myself. What advice do you have? Yeah, that's another great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where having a clear sense of what you're looking for, what's important to you about the job, and then also trusting your gut and your instincts in terms of what you did deal with at that, toxic past role, processing that a little. One of the things that happens when you're in a toxic situation, especially for a long time, is that it can kind of warp your sense of what's normal. So talking through some of that, whether it's with friends or other people, or even just reflecting on other less toxic jobs that you had, just sort of reminding yourself of what was wrong there, sort of actively bringing that top of mind. And then as you do network and ask people questions, and as you research companies and organizations, or look at job descriptions, the goal is, don't take yourself out of the running even if some red flags pop up. But definitely, as you go through the application and interview process, or through a, sort of networking your way into an interview or into a possibility, just keep your radar up. You can be very positive and open during an interview, so as not to shut down the option. But then one thing I encourage people to do right after an interview, or after a networking discussion with somebody, is to write down sort of pros and cons. What did you like about what you hear? What raised some, possible issues for you, and you would want to make sure you ask about if you get to the next round. And then another really good resource is people, if you can informally network with people who are working there, or sometimes even people who've recently worked somewhere, are an even better resource. And ask some of these tough questions, especially about some of the COVID issues, understanding how companies have handled that, how they're handling the transition, et cetera. So I think that I said a lot in response to that. I think it's try and move out of your comfort zone, be open to opportunities, consider possibilities, but also realize that networking with someone, accepting an interview, applying to a job does not mean you have to take it. You're allowed to sort of consider through every stage of that, and to seek information, and then ultimately trust your gut. So, other questions? Thanks for these. It's really good to have an opportunity to hear what's on your mind and what people are going through. Okay. What is reliable source for salary information researching a field? Yeah, it's a little bit of a composite. There are websites, many of you might have heard of glassdoor.com, which is a salary sharing as well as interviewing and other information. But there are others as well. I think if you just Google salary finders, there's actually, I think, one called salaryfinder.com. So those can be helpful. You want to take a look, you want to take those with a grain of salt. It really varies. It varies so much from location to location and title to title, even within a field. So, but it's not a bad starting point. I just wouldn't put a ton of credence against any one specific number. Some other resources in the nonprofit sector, there is an organization called PNP Staffing. It originally stood for Professionals for Nonprofits, which I think they've dropped that and just used the acronym. They do a salary report each year. It usually comes out in March. And so far, it's the ones I've seen are for New York, Philadelphia, and DC. So those can be really helpful for the nonprofit sector because they do it by sort of size of the nonprofit, size of the budget, and they do various titles within it. So that can be helpful if you're on the nonprofit side of things. Similarly, and it's not a perfect strategy, but government jobs are generally publish the salary range. So sometimes looking at an analogous role in government, to the private sector, so similar work for the government as opposed to working in the private sector. Private sector is generally going to pay more than the government, but it can be an interesting, way to get a sense. And then a couple of other sources. There's a lot of professional organizations do salary surveys every year. And so sometimes you can access that, but you probably have to have some form of membership to access that, but you could check that out. And finally, one of my favorite sources in general for career stuff is a blog called Ask a Manager, which is a workplace advice column, which actually it really helpful with a lot of things. It's sort of, there's obviously a lot of letters about toxic situations and how to handle them. She's very good on the job search in general, but she also does a salary survey every year. And I feel like she just did it back in April or May, and she ends up creating this sort of searchable Excel sheet. So if you go to Ask a Manager, ASK a Manager, and click salary, it should be one of the fairly recent entries. So I hope and then people are a source, especially when you're looking at a particular company or organization. Reaching out to your network and finding out if anybody's willing to talk about salaries can be another helpful source. With some roles tentatively remote, but with the potential of going back to in-office, what's the best way to make sure remote is still something that's a possibility for the long term? Yeah, this has been interesting. There's actually been a lot of letters to various career sites about this. So I know it's on people's minds. I think you should ask. I think that unless there's a definite declaration in the job description, a definite definition, like currently remote will be full-time in office. Sometimes they're very clear. Sometimes it's a little fuzzy. I think it's generally, if it sounds like an interesting role in an interesting place, it's probably worth taking the time to apply. And then if you were to get a first round interview, that would be a question I would ask at the end of the first round interview to make sure you're not wasting your time. So if you, for instance, absolutely want to be back in the office or absolutely want to be working full-time remote, or you're willing to do, you choose or would like to do hybrid or are willing to do hybrid, then it's good to ask about that if it's going to be a deal breaker or a big factor. So that would be my advice there. In general, are graduate schools amenable to applicants who are transitioning to a new career in their, oops, I jumped ahead too far. In their late 40s. Oh, that's interesting. So the big picture question is, in general, graduate schools, including even some of the ones we think of as kind of stodgy and unchanging, like medical school and law school. So the average age of students has been going up steadily over past decades. So from a purely data point of view, they are definitely admitting students who are older. Now, sometimes that's a couple years older, 10 years older, but certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. So I think that, yeah, the answer would be yes, they're amenable. And, no guarantee, but I think part of what's behind that is that graduate schools, as is happening elsewhere, are aware of a diversity, that a diversity of experiences, a diversity of professional experiences, and a diversity of age is a good thing for a student body and for a profession. So, and then then it will be from there all about, a strong application and particularly a strong narrative. What graduate schools are often, the key questions they're asking are why, why this program and how does this fit in with your plans? And so, being able to articulate what those plans are and how grad school fits in is probably the bigger determinant. So what to do if what you really enjoy doing doesn't make enough money to support a family? Interesting. Another great question. Side gig. um, you know, uh, you know, that's a hard one to answer. I mean, we get this question in different forms, whether it's from students just starting out who want to be part of the creative or performing arts, or want to, be an entrepreneur and open their own business, or start their own venture with the practicality of having to make a living. Very often it's a combination of what we call a day job and the side project that hopefully one day could turn into something more, and bring in more money. It is interesting, actually, that turning point where that point where you make the leap and stop doing the day job and make the leap full time into, the thing you truly love to do. It's always a risky moment. It sometimes never happens. But yeah, I think it would be, it's thinking about sort of that practicality, but I think also it's probably helpful to talk to more people, including, ourselves here at Beyond Barnard, fellow alumni, other people in your network, that it may not be obvious, there may be a way of making money in the thing you love or in something tangential to the thing you love. Not always, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but I think it's worth exploring, or, as I said, worth exploring that combination of a day job. And when I say day job, it doesn't literally mean you're going to be working 9 to 5, but it's that income producing job versus, the sort of longer term development of something that you're more in love with. So I hope that helps. Trying to see. Okay, it looks like I've answered. I think I'm supposed to be clicking these off. Oh, there's this, I think, one more. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble scrolling down on this. Is there a recording of the first? Yes, absolutely. And it's possible if one of my colleagues from alumni relations could drop that link into the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, I think when you get the follow-up to this one, we could probably put the link there as well. This one's also being recorded and there'll be a link. Okay. Oh, I see we're at 2:00. I don't want to take advantage of anybody else's time. So I'll end it there, but please let me thank you again for this, and do keep your eyes open for the third and final part of the series, which will take place in July, which will look at the bigger picture of, looking at working on some of this change. Who's out there advocating for change, and how can we all do our part in making some of these changes, lifting some of these pressures that have made it so difficult for women working during COVID. So, but I thank you all for coming, and encourage you to follow up with Beyond Barnard at barnard.edu, or alumni relations at barnard.edu if you have further questions or suggestions. And hopefully see you again in July, and take good care.